Welcome to theme 3. We're going to talk today about building relationships, making connections with people, mostly around the way you present yourself and your communication style. As we've discussed already in our previous lectures, salespeople who create relationships with their consumers are, in general, more successful because those relationships really add value to prospective customers or clients. Salespeople who feel a professional responsibility to create as much value for their customers through their relationships exhibit things like more energy, a stronger work ethic, and a greater eagerness to ask customers for decisions. In all, people who are able to build those strong professional relationships ultimately perform better in sales positions. One of the most important ways that you can build relationships with people is to have the ability to empathize. Somebody who can empathize has the ability to imagine themselves in someone else's position and understand what that person is feeling. When you're able to do this, customers perceive that empathy as as value. They feel more comfortable with the person because they feel that they're being heard and understood. Salespeople who are able to practice empathetic behavior and communicate that empathy will be perceived as more honest, accountable, and sincere, and customers will really value that as part of the relationship that they're developing with a salesperson. It's an extremely important competitive advantage that good salespeople try to cultivate. Not all relationships are good relationships. Some of the key characteristics of high quality relationships is that the relationship is built on shared values. You have the same core values or moral principles that guide your actions and behaviors. Everyone also needs to clearly understand the purpose of the partnership and be committed to the vision of the relationship. You need to know what each party brings to the table and respect and value those contributions. The role of the salesperson has to move from just selling products to being supportive. And there are actually 4 key groups of people that salespeople may need to build relationships with. First and foremost are the customers, the people who you're working with ultimately on a particular sale. But there are actually other really important partners or key groups as well that you may want to consider. Secondary decision makers, people who may not ultimately have the authority to make a decision, but can perhaps influence a decision or sway a decision, either in favor or not in favor of doing business with you. Company support staff can act as things like gatekeepers, sources of information, and play a significant role in influencing the decisions of decision makers, as well as management personnel who your customers may end up having to report to. They can have a significant role to play, and it's important to understand how you build those different relationships with these different key groups of people. The type of relationship strategy that you use should be tailored to the type of buyer that you're interacting with. If you've got a buyer who's very transaction oriented, their primary concern is price, convenience, and delivery, and they're maybe less concerned with long-term relationship building, you need to adapt your relationship strategy to be tailored to their needs. Consultative buyer needs identification through effective communication and a relationship built on trust and mutual respect. They're going to be looking to you for advice and guidance, and effective communications is extremely important with consultative buyers. Strategic alliances are building relationships with several representatives in the sellers and buyers organizations. This is by far the most challenging because obviously the more relationships you need to manage and cultivate and invest in, the harder that's going to be. But if this is a very promising big client, this could lead to a very lucrative business transaction. It may make sense to make that kind of an investment. One of the most important parts of understanding how to develop relationships is to take a good hard look at yourself and really try to look at yourself not necessarily through a critical lens, but through an objective lens. Your self concepts are all the facts, beliefs, opinions, and perceptions about yourself that are present in your everyday life. They're things that you are consciously aware of, and there may actually be many things that you're not consciously aware of. And it's worthwhile, especially in this class, but throughout your professional life, to take some time on a regular basis to really reflect on who you are and how you're interacting and engaging with other people. Some practical approaches for developing a positive self concept is to focus on the future and stop being overly concerned with past mistakes and failures. Of course, when you make a mistake or when you have a failure, you want to take the time to learn from those and to grow from those and to move forward. But people with a positive self concept don't dwell on those. They instead use those, learn their lessons, and focus on moving forward. You want to develop a high level of competence or expertise in whatever area you need to be competent or an expert in, and investing in that time to become an expert can be a really worthwhile investment in yourself. And of course, learning to develop a positive mental attitude is really important. Nobody wants to develop a relationship with a Debbie Downer, somebody who is always negative, not projecting a positive image. So it's really important to understand your mental attitude and how that's being conveyed through your actions and through your behavior. It's helpful to have a win-win mindset, both the buyer and the seller, to have a win-win mindset. This attitude, this perspective on the world, it helps to cultivate relationships. And I just want to point out a few of the differences between win-lose and win-win people. Win-lose people see a problem in every solution. They're always quick to find what might not work or how this might not be the right solution. They look for problems rather than focus on the solution. They fix the blame on somebody or something else. They are quick to assign blame for problems that do arise. They feel like life happens to them and that they have no control and that they're just sort of victims of circumstance. They tend to focus or live in the past, focusing on past decisions, maybe past mistakes, and fail to look forward to the future. And they make promises that they may never keep. However, when you look at win-win people, they focus on helping others to solve their problems. That's their focal point. They don't look or dwell on the problems. They're focused on the solution to problems. They focus on what caused the problems and fixing those issues. They don't blame. They don't wallow. Their emphasis or focal point is on fixing the problem. They make life joyous for themselves and for others. They bring joy and they approach life with a joyous attitude. They learn from the past. It's not that they ignore it. They learn from the past. They live in the present and focus on the future. Set goals for the future, and that's what they're aiming for. That's what they're focused on. And they make commitments to themselves and to others, and they keep them. There's people that you can rely on and depend on because they do what they say they're going to do. We talked a few slides ago about the importance of empathy and being able to relate to and connect to somebody else's point of view and sort of see the world through their eyes. Research shows actually that young people today have significantly less empathy than previous generations. It's tied primarily to living in a virtual or digital age where a lot of people's relationships with others are done digitally as opposed to in person, and that seems to reduce the amount of empathy people have. That's not to say that young people don't have any empathy. Of course they do, but that it's notably less than it was in previous generations. And something that I think young people have to really focus on and work on is to try to imagine what it must be like to be someone else and how they're feeling, and to look at the world through their eyes if you can. In contrast to that, ego is the inner force that makes salespeople want to make the sale. There's nothing wrong with, a lot of people think the word ego is a bad thing, and ego is not a bad thing. You need to have confidence. You need to be motivated. You need to be driven. There's nothing wrong with that. It's when your ego gets in the way of the relationships you're trying to build and the goals you're trying to achieve. That's when ego becomes problematic. An ego, everyone has an ego, and egos are not necessarily bad things. It's when egos get out of control that it becomes problematic. We're going to switch gears a little bit and start talking about communication strategies, because you can't build relationships with people without communicating with them. And there's really two broad strategies for communication. So there's, of course, verbal strategies, the words that you use to express yourself, whether they're oral or written, are really important in terms of establishing lines of communications. But also don't forget that your nonverbal messaging is an extremely important part of the communication process as well. There's an old saying, I'm not sure how accurate it is, that about 80% of human communication is actually nonverbal. I don't know if that 80% is actually correct, but it's certainly accurate to say that a lot of our communication strategies are in fact nonverbal. So things like facial expressions and eye contact, tone of voice, gestures, your appearance, your posture, all of these nonverbal things communicate information to other people. And it's really important to be very mindful of your verbal and your nonverbal strategies. We spend a lot of time in the business program encouraging you to become a better writer, and also to encourage you to become a better speaker by getting you to do presentations in our classroom. I'm not sure we spend enough time talking to you about the importance of nonverbal communication skills. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about those today. When thinking about nonverbal strategies, these are the non-spoken messages, how we communicate with people through not the words that we use, but through our body language, our eye contact, the way we are behaving. Those sorts of things communicate messages to people. The tone of your voice, the volume, the speed of delivery, etc. When there's a discrepancy between what you're saying verbally, either written or orally, and your nonverbal messages, the person you're communicating with is less apt to trust you. When there's a discrepancy between your words and your actions, people become distrustful. So it's really important to think about your nonverbal strategies from the very, very beginning of any communication or interaction that you have with other people. Now, normally when I teach this class in person, when we get to talking about things like shaking hands, facial expressions, and eye contact, we actually take a break in the class and I send students out across campus, and I encourage them to go up and introduce themselves to people, shake their hand, and have a brief conversation, and to evaluate the person that they're speaking with and themselves in terms of the quality of the handshake, their facial expressions, and their ability to maintain eye contact. Some of the things that influence those first initial meetings, those first impressions, is making eye contact when you're shaking someone's hand. When you reach out to shake someone's hand, you need to make eye contact with them. The degree of firmness. I'm certain all of us at some point have shaken someone's hand and they've either practically crushed all the bones in your hand, or they give you what I call the limp handshake, where you know what I mean when I say a limp hand. They barely grasp your hand. It kind of feels sort of weak and disengaged. The depth of the interlock. How long do you hold? The strength of the grip and how long you hold on to someone's hand has an impact on the messaging and the way the handshake is interpreted. And of course, the degree of dryness. Nobody wants to shake hands with somebody whose palms are all sweaty and gross. When you're shaking someone's hand for the first time, this is the best time to introduce yourself and give the person your name. So hand out, hi, my name is Susan Graham. That's the best time to do that. The longer you wait afterwards, the more awkward it is to share your name or to ask someone's name. So that's a great time to do that. Things like facial expressions are also really important. Um, our facial expressions are largely universal, even across cultures. A lot of the basic facial expressions that we make when we interact with people are actually very, very similar, despite cultural differences. And people trust a smiling face. I remember years ago when we were hiring, I wasn't working for the university at the time. I was working for the province, and we were looking to hire a receptionist for our office. And the previous one was, she was quite competent, but she was the kind of person who always had a scowl on their face. They always looked like they were in a bad mood and grouchy and unpleasant. And that wasn't necessarily the case with this person, but they always looked that way. And I remember an HR manager telling the hiring team that if you want to hire somebody who's friendly and welcoming, you need to hire somebody who is a natural smiler, somebody who smiles a lot. So if that's something that you may want to think about, um, people trust smiling faces. Eye contact with people says I'm listening. So if this was a real class when we were in a physical, like in-person class, I actually, when I'm in front of the classroom talking, I can make a note of who's actually looking at me, who's looking at their cell phone, who's looking at their laptop, who's got their eyes closed and are probably trying to take a nap. And I'm acutely aware of that. Eye contact says I'm listening, I'm paying attention, I think you are somebody worthy of giving my attention to. So that's really important. It shows respect and understanding and ultimately leads to trust. But prolonged eye contact or staring can be perceived as threatening. So you want to be careful. You don't want to glare at somebody or make the eye contact so intense that it becomes intimidating. But certainly eye contact is really important. Appearance is another important factor when you meet people for the very first time. And a general rule to think about is to dress for the job you want, not the job you have, and to be slightly uh, more dressed up than people would expect you to be. You obviously don't want to be substantially more dressed up than people expect you to be, but it is good to be just slightly more professional in appearance than what your customers or clients or who you're meeting with would expect. So that could be a golf shirt and casual dress pants for male students or male salespersons. It could be a casual blouse and dress pants or a skirt for female sales officers. It doesn't have to be a full business suit. You want to gauge the appearance, how you should dress based on what the expectations of the clients are. And when in doubt, you should look at your peers in the organization and see how they're dressed and dress either the same level or slightly better. This is one area where you may want to get some advice and feedback from other people because I'm not sure that individuals are very good at assessing their own tone of voice or how they speak. So I think this is one area where it's really good to get somebody else's opinion. It's not easy to change your voice, but you can work to make it more pleasing. You don't want to speak too quickly or too slowly. That was something I really had to work on early in my teaching days. Students thought I spoke too quickly, and so I had to work on that. You want to avoid speech patterns that are dull or colorless. You want to have some animation to your voice, make it interesting. I had a professor when I was a business student at UPEI. It was a 3-hour class, and it was the operations class. It wasn't Gary Evans. It was long before his time. And it was a 3-hour class, and the professor was excellent and very, very knowledgeable, but he only spoke in one tone the whole time for 3 hours, and it sounded like a drone. And so it was very, very hard to focus. So it really is important to have some animation, some energy in your voice. It helps to keep people engaged. And of course, you want to try to avoid bad speech habits, and we all have them to some extent. You want to avoid teen speak, the use of excessive like, the word like in your vocabulary. You want to avoid poor grammar, and you want to avoid language that is too casual or too informal. So you want to make sure you think about these and practice these on a regular basis, and get some feedback from somebody who you're talking to. Of course, the way you speak in a professional environment doesn't necessarily have to match the way you would speak with your friends when you're out at a social event, but you do want to practice developing good professional speaking habits. It's important to understand etiquette or basic sort of manners that are expected in the business environment. Um, Good etiquette can change based on various cultural considerations, but good etiquette can set the tone for those preliminary stages of a relationship. One of the first tips is to avoid the temptation to address a new prospect by their first name before you're invited to do so, especially if that person is in a position of power over you. So they're more senior than you, or they are older than you. And certainly in some cultures, this is more important than in other cultures. I make a point on the first day of class of telling my students that you're welcome to call me by my first name, and that's actually my preferred way to be addressed by students in most situations. There may be times when I do expect you to be a bit more formal, but in general, most students can call me Susan, and I'm perfectly happy with that. But ultimately, you should wait until you are invited to use someone's first name. And when you are invited to use someone's first name, please make sure you do not abbreviate it or make it into a nickname or some sort of shortened form of that name. That is considered to be very disrespectful and only appropriate for close personal contacts, and certainly not business contacts. Of course, you want to avoid offensive comments or stories. And in this day and age, we're so increasingly sensitive and aware about offending people that you need to be even more conscious of this than you maybe have been in the past. So you want to avoid those sorts of things. Of course, recognize the importance of punctuality. Anyone who's had me as a professor before knows how I feel about punctuality. Um, I am so conscientious of being on time that people who know me know that if I'm late for something, you can guarantee something's happened um, that I cannot control, because I'm never, ever, ever late. I try to instill that in my students and encourage students to show up to class early for a number of reasons. One is because it's extremely disrespectful to be late, especially on a regular basis. Obviously, sometimes it's going to happen that you're late, but when you're late on a regular basis, that shows a gross level of disrespect. It's also very disruptive because when I start class at whenever the class time is, and I've started talking about what's coming up and what's due and various assignments and deliverables that are coming due, it's very disruptive to have somebody coming in the class. So it's really, really, really important to be punctual. And if you can't be on time, then you should be early. And if that's not a habit that you have already instilled in yourself, it's one you should get into the habit of doing. It's incredibly important, and it is a sign of respect for the other person that you're meeting with. When you invite a customer to lunch, for example, you don't want to discuss business before the meal is ordered unless the client initiates. So it's important to understand how to balance casual chit chat and when to bring up specific business items. When you leave a voicemail, you want to leave a clear and concise message without going on and on and on. And you want to avoid checking your phone or being overly reliant on your phone when you're meeting face to face with somebody else. It's extremely disruptive and very disrespectful. What it's telling the person is that whatever's on your phone is more important than they are, and that's a habit that a lot of young people need to get over and get over quickly. It's not appropriate. In fact, I would encourage you, whether it's job interviews or meeting potential clients or business partners, I would encourage you to leave your phone either in your bag or in your pocket and don't check it at all. There isn't one single communication style that is right or better than others. There's a variety of different communication styles, and they can each work in different ways in different circumstances for different people. It takes into account people's personalities, their preferred style of communication, how they like to communicate, and how they like to be communicated with. And of course, the whole aspect of these communications being based on selling and the selling relationship, that has an influence on communication styles as well. So we're going to talk a lot about communication styles over the next few slides. We all have biases when it comes to communication styles. There's ways we prefer to be communicated with and the ways we prefer to communicate to people. And it's really important that we learn about our own communication preferences and learn about or think about the potential communication preferences of other people so that we can adjust our own style to meet the needs of whoever it is we're communicating with. Some basic principles of communications. Everyone is different. Differences exist and they are important. There isn't one right way or one wrong way. Differences are valid and real and important, but we don't need to get hung up on them either. A communication style is a way of thinking and behaving. It's the way we project our ideas and share our ideas with other people. Individual style differences tend to be stable. However, whatever your preference is in terms of communication style, that's relatively stable over your lifetime. Although I will say for myself, I find that my communication style in the classroom is very different than my communication style in my personal life or my home life. Um, but but those styles or those preferences in general tend to be fairly stable. And there's a finite number of styles, and we're going to talk about 4 different communication styles in a few minutes. To create the most productive relationships, it is important that the two people who are trying to establish that relationship get their communication styles in sync. You need to be able to speak each other's language in order to establish that important rapport between two people. Since this class is taking the perspective of a salesperson, and obviously salespeople have a vested interest in establishing good relationships with potential clients, it's important for salespeople to be able to alter or modify their communication styles to meet the needs of the other person. If you can do that, it gives you a distinct advantage over people who don't or are not able to do that, and it greatly reduces the possibility of tension or conflict between the person that you're trying to establish that relationship with and yourself. There are lots of different communication models out there. The one we're going to focus on in this class examines communication styles based on dominance and on sociability, the ability to control or control your emotions and your expressiveness in your communication style. So we're going to look at each of the 4 different styles and where they fit on the quadrant that we're looking at here. And we'll talk about some different strategies you can use if you're communicating with somebody who you think has this particular communication style. And I want you to think about yourself and do some personal reflection to think about your own communication style and how you like to be communicated with as we're going through this. So the first communication style that we're going to talk about is the emotive style. Some of the characteristics, verbal and nonverbal characteristics of this particular style, the communication is quite active. It takes the social initiative. This person takes the social initiative in most cases. So they're the ones who walk over to you and extend their hand and introduce themselves to you. They like to encourage informality. So they might say, you know, my name is Dr. Graham, but please you can call me Susan. They move very quickly from a formal to an informal style of communication. And they freely express emotional opinions. They're not afraid to show emotions in their communications on a regular basis and fairly early in the relationship. They want to create a quick social relationship and usually feel relatively comfortable in a more informal atmosphere. If you're trying to build a relationship with somebody who you think is an emotive communicator, then you want to move at a pace that's going to hold their attention. Slow paces or monotone paces or will not hold their attention. You need to have some energy and enthusiasm in your communication style. You need to be enthusiastic and avoid being stiff or overly formal. You want to take time to build goodwill and establish those relationships, but they will happen relatively quickly with this group. They don't want to emphasize or focus too much on facts and details. They're more interested in the relationship and building that relationship. You want to support their opinions, their ideas, and their dreams. You want to ask them questions because they're probably going to be quite talkative. You want to maintain eye contact and listen attentively to what they're saying. The next style of communicator is the director style. Some of the verbal and nonverbal characteristics, they appear to be quite busy. They may not give the impression of not listening to you because maybe they're trying to multitask and are listening and also trying to finish typing something on their computer or doing something else. They tend to display a very serious attitude and they like to maintain control. They tend to be very frank, demanding, assertive, and determined. If you're trying to build a relationship with somebody who has a directive communication style, you want to be very businesslike all the time. They're not interested in the social interaction or casual chit chat. Focus on business. Be very efficient, time disciplined, and well organized. Don't waste their time. They're not interested in somebody wasting their time. They want to get right down to business right away. Use facts, figures, and success probabilities. So they're looking for numbers, they're looking for evidence in order to help them learn and understand what you're trying to convey. You want to let them know that you're going to help them meet their objectives, and you want to ask specific questions and take very careful notes because for people who are directive communication style, the devil is in the details. If you're trying to connect with someone who has a reflective communication style, they like to control their emotional expression. They're not very emotional or emotive when they communicate. They display a preference for orderliness and organization. They tend to express measured opinions. They're not free with their ideas and free with their thoughts. They're very cautious in sharing those things with somebody, especially somebody they don't know well. And they can seem very difficult to get to know because they are so reserved and not willing to share of themselves easily. They're a stickler for detail. They're very reserved and very cautious in their communication style. If you're trying to communicate with somebody who has a reflective communication style, you want to be prompt and well prepared and use a no nonsense, business like approach. You want to present in a slow and deliberate way, not too much information and too quickly. You want to be slow and methodical to allow the person you're communicating with to digest more slowly what it is you're trying to say. You want to show them proof and documentation. They're not just going to take your word for it. They're going to be looking for evidence, and you never want to pressure them to make a quick decision. They're somebody who needs to reflect and consider their options and make their decision on their own time. The last communication style in this particular model is called the supportive style. People who communicate in this way give the appearance of being quiet and reserved, and they listen attentively to other people. They tend to avoid the use of power and the exertion of power, and they make decisions in a thoughtful and deliberate manner. They take their time to reflect and are not easily rushed into decisions. They tend to be lighthearted, rather quiet, and unassuming. If you're communicating with somebody who has a supportive communication style, it helps if you learn about their family, their hobbies, or their interests to help build that social relationship. You want to listen carefully to personal opinions and feelings. You want to be professional, but also have a friendly social approach to your interactions. You want to offer personal assurances and support, and be patient and avoid conflict if at all possible. As we wind down this particular lecture for this week, it's really important to be careful not to use labels to make people feel like they're boxed in or typecast or judged. The reality is, all of us use all of these various communication styles on a regular basis. We may have preferences for one over the other, and we may use one or two more than we use the others. But we actually don't like to be classified as in a singular way, and it's important not to do that. Classify the person's strengths and preferences, but recognize that the person is much more complicated than a grocery list of behaviors that we can expect from them. These are guidelines, they're not rules.